Meeting of the Cromwell Board of Education at 6:32 p.m. Catherine, would you do a roll call, please?
Sure. Mrs. Kelleher,
Here?
Mrs. Cantwell,
She will not be here.
Mrs. Cloutier, Ms. Franklin, Mrs. Lamberson, Mrs. Post, I'm here. Mr. Schuman, Mr. Zabrowski. Okay, the roll call is complete.
Thank you. Next, we have approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve the agenda for tonight? Dipty, second by Allen. Thank you. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes. The agenda is approved. And our first agenda item tonight is report of our Board of Finance Liaison. Mr. John Ireland has put together a nice presentation for us all, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Is it okay if I remove this, or I got to keep it on? Am I okay?
Dr. Macri, is that okay? We're beyond 6 feet?
Thank you. All right. So anyway, thank you so much for having us here this evening. My name is John Ireland. I'm the chairman of the Board of Finance in town. I am joined by two of my colleagues here tonight. This is Steve Waganowski, the vice chairman of the committee, Ed Maley from the Board of Finance here as well. And really what we want to do is provide a quick overview of our committee, what we do, how we do it, why we do it, and then give a brief overview through here and really have a dialogue. As we go through this, if you've got questions, something pops out to you that you want to answer, please. I want this to be more of a discussion than than just me telling you what's going on. I want to make sure I answer questions and really just make sure everyone is kind of comfortable with what we do and how we get there. So, all right. So real quick as an overview, we're going to kind of go through 5 different items. We're going to get into the 3 different types of budgets that we really have associated with the town. The revenue sources as far as how we make those budgets work and connect and fund those. Some key consideration and factors that we need to take into account, some of them more recent than others, COVID as being the big one there. And then just provide some information around who the board members are, what our typical meeting kind of looks like and what we do, what our budget timeline typically is. We kind of get started in the middle of March, and then by hopefully the middle of May, knock on wood, we've gone through the referendum. We set the mill rate in order to determine what will happen with the taxes for the next coming year. And then July 1 hits and our new fiscal year starts, and we go from there. So, and then at the end, I'll put up my email address that I've got set up for the committee. You can email me, reach out to me anytime, happy to answer any questions or go through anything there. So, all right. First up. All right. So, our fiscal year runs July 1 to June 30th. Okay. And there's basically 4 different areas within here. And I mentioned 3 budgets because the last one is one that we don't have any real impact or effect on. The fire district is its own separate entity. They have their own mill rate and their own, body and organization there that affects their budget. But your budget, the Board of Education, is about 60% of the overall budget for the town. Since fiscal year 2013, so that's going to be 2012 to 2013 year, okay, the budget has grown about 26%, okay? And the other key item that we need to bear in mind with that is that from the state statutes or law, the budget for the following year, for the most part, needs to be the minimum of what the prior year was, okay? So it's going to be a constant growth. Now, I don't have the specifics around how that could possibly come down or change. I don't know if you want to speak to either that, Steve or Ed, but it really, for the most part, what we need to bear in mind is that once we kind of set that floor, the next year, for the most part, it's going to, at the very least, remain that floor. Does that make sense? Okay. The general government budget is about 33% of the total town expenditures. That has grown about 27%, so pretty much in line with what the Board of Education has seen. And this is going to encompass town services, police department, public works, those type of items there. The remaining amount, about 7%, is our bonded debt. And this is going to be major capital, investments that we have made. And that makes about 7%. And that $3.6 million that you see on there, that is an annual number. that we pay to pay off the debt for any project that we've got. And eventually, it depending upon how long the bond was, it was for 20 years, 25 years. You know, Woodside is still, that's getting towards the tail end. That'll eventually be paid off, and then that number would then be reduced because we have paid off the debt associated with that. So, anything to add? Any questions around any of those? No? Yeah, go ahead.
Have you had any other major expenditures for the bonded debt since Woodside?
I don't have the list of specific projects with me. Does anything big ring a bell for you guys?
Well, the biggest expenditure that we would have had would have been the library. But what we've done over the last few years is we realized that we were holding back in our reserve probably more than we should have been. And so we ended up sort of reorganizing our priorities a little bit and ended up paying cash for the library. So we had intended to bond for that, but we did not.
Yeah, it was a Public Works building.
The Public Works building was also bonded in that area. That's about $10 million.
Okay, and again, the key part is that 3.6 right now is an annualized number. So that's not what's left. That's what we have to pay every year. So that comes out of the whole 54.3. That if you add up those three budgets, those three numbers, that is what, you know, we expend right now as an operating budget for this year. All right, next slide. All right, so next, where does the revenue come from in order to take care of all those different items? So the total of the three budgets for, again, fiscal year 22, what we're in right now, is about $54.3 million if you add all those together, okay? The vast majority of how we take care of that is local property taxes. All right, we're projecting to collect around $46 million of local property taxes in the current fiscal year, okay? The amount that each household, business, or car is determined upon a couple of factors, okay? Every town basically has a grand list, right? And this is going to be a listing of what we have within the town that is taxable, okay? So whether it be, you know, your house, car tax, commercial tax, you know, for the business, there are certain parameters that is set by the state, okay? And that grand list is basically meant to be put together by an independent body, okay? And that is reviewed every 5 years. And I think we're coming up on that next year. Okay? And that's done by an independent group, and that will then reevaluate and make sure the grand list is up to date, up to the right values, that kind of thing. So the key here to take a look at the grand list, right, is that one of the things on the Board of Finance that we want to check out and review is where the grand list is going from the previous year to the next fiscal year. Because if we have growth on the grand list, that means that we're able to find more things to be able to assess taxes to, but not necessarily increase the mill rate. So your individual tax that on the asset you currently had would stay relatively the same, but there is just more stuff. There's more goods on there that we'd be able to collect revenue on, and that's how we'd be able to grow our local tax base. And then if there's an increased need in the budgets here, how we can supplant that with hopefully not affecting the mill rate we currently have in town. Okay? And so really what the rest of the slide just talks about is what the parameters are. It's pretty much 70% of the set value or the depreciated value. And again, those are things that are outside of our control. Those are set and done, and those are the assessments that are made by the company that comes in and does it, and it is set by the state of Connecticut. So anything that I misspoke on there, or no? Good? Any questions? Matt? Come on.
I'm all right. I'm actually just wondering how often does the mill rate wind up going up? I know it's been steady for a couple of years, but how, like, do we know approximately, like, every so many years the mill rate tends to go up a little percentage?
So we will set, and that'll be as part of the budget timeline that we get on here. The mill rate is basically, that gets set after the budget goes to the referendum to the town, okay? Because then we know as an organization what we need to fund expense-wise, right? It's a little bit of a, I don't want to say a backwards way of looking at it, but it's a way of we need to figure out and collect what our expenses are going to be, and then the mill rate comes in at the end to figure out how to fund it. It's not, hey, we have this, amount of money to spend, let's divvy it up. It's everyone comes together with what the expenses are, and then we, based upon the determinations of looking at maybe where other revenue streams are going to be, then we set the mill rate. So the mill rate gets set annually, depending upon what the budget looks like for that year. So to answer your question, that has been stable going back, I don't know, at least going back 8 years, I think. 4 years? My apologies, 4 years.
Question on tax incentives. How much tax incentives affect grand list?
So anything related to a business coming in and possibly getting some sort of agreement like that, that is actually a part of the town council's judgment. I don't believe we get involved with negotiating those.
No, but how much is?
It's a lot less than you think. It's roughly, I think, trying to remember, there's very few, first of all, and I think it's less than $100,000 annually. It's not as common as, people think every business that comes into town gets one. They don't.
Any other questions on the local taxes? Okay. So, I think you might have skipped one. Or go back. There we go. Okay, so here we are talking about the mill rate, right? So what is the mill rate? So a mill is equal to $1 of tax for each 1,000 of assessment, okay? So to calculate the property tax, you multiply the assessment of the property and divide by 1,000. So as an example, if we have an assessed value of $50,000, okay, and a mill rate of 20 mills would have a property tax of $1,000 per year, okay? Our current mill rate in town is 30.33, and that does not include the fire district aspect that I mentioned previously, okay? And again, we increase tax revenue by either looking at expanding the grand list or increasing the mill rate. And then, again, here's a mill rate math example, right? So if we've got a grand list, and these are just round numbers just to try to make it easy. If our grand list in town is $1.5 billion, okay, the current mill rate in town is 30.33. This will give us approximately $45.5 million of local tax revenue, assuming we collect it all. Okay, so this doesn't equal the 54.3 because we've got some other items we'll talk about later as far as where some other revenue sources are going to be coming in. Okay, after the next fiscal budget is set, so we've gone to the referendum, there's a need to increase the revenue from 45.5 to 47 million to support it. So it's a 2.77% increase in the overall budget. Let's just say we're going from 54.3 to 55.8. Okay, the grand list and the other revenue sources just take that out of it. We're just going to leave everything as is, just to say, okay, this is going to affect the mill rate as we move forward. So in order to generate the additional $1.5 million, the mill rate would then increase from 30.33 to 31.33. Okay, so if we take that 31.33 and multiply by the $1.5 billion divided by 1,000, you get the 47 million of revenue. Okay, so we needed to go through and generate another $1.5 million. What does that mean on a micro level? What does that mean for someone in their home, their own personal budget? How are they going to look at it, right? So let's just use a home assessed at $200,000. Okay, the expiring mill rate was 30.33, and so the current tax bill was $6,066. Okay, for the new fiscal year, we increased the mill rate to 31.33. So the new tax bill then is $62.66. A full mill times $200,000 worth of assessed value increases their tax bill for that year by $200. So that's just meant to kind of give you a little overview on, okay, we generate an extra $1.5 million. How does that possibly impact, the taxpayer or the resident in town? And so obviously I picked a house value just kind of at random there, but that's just to kind of give you some insight as far as when we're going through and trying to make decisions and look at all the factors. Those are some of the things that we're trying to bear in mind, is that, if we do increase the mill rate or we need to, ask for certain things, that there is an impact in someone's home, condo unit, whatever the case might be. So, anything Good? All right. So, other areas that we can generate revenue in town, okay, to try to get to that 54. We project that the state will actually contribute around $5.3 million in revenue to the town of Cromwell, okay? And this is something that has come in from the state every year consistently for as long as we can track. I mean, is there any? Yeah. Yeah, more or less. So we absolutely count it and count on it as part of our budget to come in to help supplant some of the tax revenue that we don't then have to charge the taxpayer here in town. Okay? And if for some reason something happened to it, we got to find a way to potentially plug that hole. Okay? We do review and take a look at grants as different organizations come before us during the year. A lot of times that'll involve us fronting that money or allocating that money. They go through, take care of the item, and then the grant money is then reimbursed, back to us. And then miscellaneous fees throughout the year, things related to different departments or different offices within the town, that'll generate some, service fees or assessments or whatever the case might be there. So, any questions around any of those? No?
Well, you know what? Let me just go back.
Sure.
To answer your question. I answered that question based on old information. It occurred to me. And I was trying to look it up to see what the new number is, and I have no Wi-Fi here, unfortunately. But I will try to get you the number. I think that number is accurate. It certainly was a few years ago. Just want to let you know. Working on old info.
Okay, so just to kind of give a little, a background and thought process on what are some of the things that as we're sitting down and trying to consider and look at everyone's budget, what the process is, why is it we look at or think, certain things. So the first item on there, I'll say, the past two budgets obviously have been impacted by COVID, right? We started, unfortunately, having lockdowns come middle of March of 2020. As I mentioned before, our budget process starts, right around there. And going back at the time, we were really trying to question and say how much of an impact is this going to have on our local residents, on businesses, on all those kind of things. So, we were really trying to gather as much information as we could and try to guess as best we could as far as how things may get impacted from a budget standpoint. As I mentioned previously, we talk about what changes are made to the grand list. Obviously, an expanded grand list allows us to be able to do more things without affecting the mill rate and increasing taxes to people. If for some reason the grand list shrinks and we're already in the hole, that's obviously a very bad thing. Our goal is to try to keep 2 months of expenditures to keep the town going if, God forbid, there is some sort of catastrophe or emergency that takes place in town. Obviously we're seeing some things happen along the Midwest over the past week, and, God forbid something, were to happen around this way. We want to make sure that we can keep the basic functions and the basic items of the town going if we need to. And then we currently, have a AAA bond rating, and that is, that really comes into play as we take a look at major capital expenditures. And keeping that high bond rating allows us to hopefully get the best terms, best interest rate, and then allows us to be able to save the taxpayer, dollars from that standpoint and be able to borrow at more favorable terms. So, any other considerations that you guys want to know? Yeah.
The town was given some grant money for COVID relief funds, correct?
Yes.
And are those, how are those distributed? I'm assuming you guys are in charge of distributing them to different departments as needed, or do I know Board of Ed got their 2-year, is basically what ours have been. And I believe it's similar for the towns too. It's a 2-year, very specific rules around them. But are you in charge of dividing up where that money goes?
So, from my understanding, and guys jump in if I misspeak here, but from my understanding, there has been, I believe, one action item taken formally with those funds, and that starts with the town council. Town council is the one that approves it and then sends it over to us for our review and approval, and then moves forward from there. There are some parameters and tight guidelines around how those funds are going to be distributed and used here in town as well.
Right.
And unfortunately, I can't speak directly to what those may be or look like. I think in the last report we received, they're saying they're still trying to finalize what those are going to look like. And so I believe, and I don't want to speak for the town, but I believe what they're trying to do is be a little cautious on moving forward too quickly with that, because at the end of the day, if there is an expenditure made using those funds and it turns out it's not within their scope or parameters, then there's a potential at audit that you got to give
Right.
them back.
Very similar to how ours works for the board. And I believe that was what they're trying to do, is get it out to small businesses to start, to keep them kind of help out with some of their expenses that they had. Wasn't that the first one?
That's a separate program.
Okay.
I thought one of you guys had something more on this, no? Okay. Steve?
I guess the only thing, John, would be, only because you mentioned that that other loan program from the federal government, for the small businesses, that is a very different program. So the American Rescue Plan funds that both the education got some and the town got some. The town manager, really working with the town council, will be putting forth ideas. Ultimately, the Board of Finance, our job will simply be to understand what that is, understand if it's a one-time cost, or is it going to be a cost that's going to create ongoing costs for us. So we have to think about that into the future. Because with anything, if you go ahead and spend the money and you do something like fix a pothole on a road, in theory that's a one-time thing, the pothole's fixed and then it's done. If you do something like add a new service to the town, which could be great, the problem is those funds will eventually run out, and then we have to consider how are we going to pay for that in the long term. So again, really the town manager working with the council will come forward with the ideas, and then our job maybe to be a gatekeeper and say no, or maybe to say yes. Ultimately, we have the yes or no at the very end, but we're not part right now anyways of the idea process or deciding how that money will be spent. Okay?
Thanks, Steve. Anybody else? Good? Okay. So we are a makeup of 6 members. That's a part of the Board of Finance. We have 2 alternates as well, as you can see, Ann and Gail down the bottom there. Our meetings are the last Thursday of the month at 7 o'clock over at Town Hall at the Town Council chambers. And typically we will receive updates from the finance director and the town manager as far as what is going on within the town, how we are doing, expense-wise and revenue-wise, and is there anything we need to be concerned about? There's a certain area that got under, that's under budget that we need to keep an eye on, and then figure out, how to potentially, take care of that later on in the fiscal year if necessary. And then we'll discuss and take action on items that come before us, capital expenditures, grants, things of that nature that have gone before the town council, and then eventually leads to coming to us. So, okay. And then I mentioned previously the budget timeline. So we typically, on the board, we'd love to try to get the books containing the numbers and the ask, by beginning to middle of March, if possible. We then will have presentations from the Board of Education, and then along with the town manager, by the end of March and the beginning of April. We then typically will then vote on those budgets come beginning to middle of April, and depending upon how many meetings or how many nights we need in order to help make that determination, we'll set meetings, special meetings for those evenings. The referendum to the town is then typically the first Tuesday in May. If it passes, that is when the Board of Finance will then get together and set that mill rate and determine how we're going to fund the expenditures that the town then passed. If the referendum is turned down, we then get back together, try to assess what we need to do to the budget, and then put it back out to the referendum so that it can get the green light from the town after that. Then tax bills are then generated, set for July 1st, and then we start the fiscal year from there. Okay. And again, that email address there, you can email, that'll come right to me. You can email me anytime with any questions, any concerns, anything you want to discuss. Like I said, really what I'm hoping for starting tonight is to just kind of have that dialogue. And what we wanted to try to accomplish tonight was to give a little, overview and insight as far as what we do on our side, on the Board of Finance, what we need to consider, all the different factors that go into it, and just hopefully again start that conversation, that dialogue, so that way when the time comes and we do need to take a look at all the budgets, obviously yours included, you kind of have a little more understanding and review of the things that we need to consider in order to set a budget and take a look at what the economic situation is in town, where we feel like state funds may be coming from. As I mentioned, COVID was a big factor over the last couple of years. Inflation will probably be the big word that we'll be talking about, come over the next couple of months, and how's that going to impact things. So, again, reach out to me anytime. Be happy to, grab a cup of coffee with you, have a conversation if you have any questions or concerns. Because again, this is about the time that budgets will start to get prepped and going. And my door is always open. I know my colleagues too. They'd be happy to answer any questions or meet with you and stuff as well. So.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. It's really informative, and I love having everything in writing. I think it'll be very helpful for all of us. So thank
Okay.
you, Ed and Steve and John.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
All right, next on our agenda is an executive session for the purpose of discussion and possible action of agreement between the Cromwell Board of Education and the Cromwell School Administrators Union contract between July 1st, 2022 and June 30th, 2025, and also discussion and possible action of agreement between the Cromwell Board of Education and Local 1303-280, the Paraprofessionals Union. a motion to approve the agreement between the Cromwell Board of Education and the Cromwell Schools Administrator Union contract July 1st, 2022 through June 30th, 2025. Is there a second? All in favor? Are you taking notes?
Yep.
Okay, opposed? Abstentions? The Administrators Union contract is approved. And next, is there a motion to approve the agreement between the Cromwell Board of Education and Local 1303-280 of Council Number 4, AFSCME, July 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2024, the paraprofessional and nurse coordinator contract?
Motion to approve.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Both contracts are now approved. All right, and our final business tonight is new business. We have board member training. And for that, we have Attorney Jessica Ritter from Shipman and Goodwin. We do this training every couple of years or so. So do we have a presentation we need?
While she sets up, can I do?
I'm sorry?
I'll stay home.
Are you all set? Okay. Okay.
My high schooler was actually on the bus. 'cause
So-
she was a cheerleader, so.
Sorry, Catherine. Jessica had let us know that if you have questions during the presentation, you can feel free to ask them at any time. You don't have to wait until the end of the presentation when she asks for questions, and I'll turn it over to Jessica Ritter. Thank you.
Great, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate being here. Built in some questions that are taken from some live scenarios.
I'm so sorry, but do you mind speaking into the mic a little bit? Thank you. Just for the people watching remotely, all of them. Did you push
Is
the
that
button?
better?
Yes.
Okay, I want to be able to see I'm gonna move this up a little bit, then I can't see the presentation. Okay, so that's better? Okay, so you have the little responders in front of you. We've built in some scenarios into the presentation that are taken off of actual live examples that we at Shipman have experienced. We will quiz you using the responders. All the data we collect is anonymous, so I have no idea how you vote, but hopefully you will share your insight with us and we'll foster and have some good dialogue and conversation. As Selena said, I don't need to stick to a script, so if you have specific questions or there's anything you want to talk about in further detail, we can certainly spend time on that. Let me know how much time we have, because I know it's a little bit later than we anticipated, so I want to be respectful of your time, because then I will highlight what I think are the most important takeaways from this evening. I think we can get this done in an hour. I don't want to keep you guys there too late. Yeah. Why don't we go with that? But okay. So let's aim for that. Okay. So now that you're a Board of Education member, what does that mean? Now, I know for some of you, you are novice and this is new. Some of you are very seasoned and experienced. But even my most seasoned Board of Education members have said to me, I didn't know that. So there are some things that I think even those of you who've been on the board for a while may pick up. So you are an agent of the state. What does that mean? So fundamentally, if you look at our Connecticut Constitution, it makes clear that the legislator has delegated significant authority and powers to our local boards of education. You act to implement the educational interests of the state. So it's a pretty awesome responsibility that you have as Board of Education members, because you have to make sure that you implement your statutory duties that require that we provide an appropriate and equal education for all of our students. So that's ultimately your number one objective. In that role, there are a few things that I would say are of critical importance that you as a Board of Education member will do. You are a policymaker for the school district. So have we done committee assignments yet, Selena? Okay, how many of you are on the policy committee? Okay, and how's that gone so far? Now, Catherine, I know that you're a veteran board member. How have you enjoyed your time on the policy committee?
It's been interesting. Some of it's been challenging, but there's a lot that comes forward. A lot of policies we've been updating.
Yes. So it can be a very painstaking process. Right. It is. And one of the reasons why it's so important is because you, as a policymaker, need to really think about, okay, 10,000 feet above, I need to think about the policies that I want to implement here in Cromwell. But you also have a lot of policies that the state has mandated and required that you implement where you as Board of Education members really don't have a lot of say. So for instance, your DCF policy, that is all driven and governed by statute. Dipti, you're a teacher, so you know. There's not much the Board of Education can do to say, I'm going to look at the DCF policy and I'm going to make changes that I think would be tailored to work best in Cromwell. You don't have that authority. Certainly there are some other policies with respect to grading and ranking or some academic or some curriculum issues that you have greater authority over, but I can understand that this can be a frustrating part of being a Board of Education member. But the one important takeaway is you are the broad policymakers, your superintendent of schools, your director of student services, and your administrators are the ones who are implementing the regulations that are associated with the policies. They are responsible for the day-to-day operational issues, which we as Board of Education members want to make sure that we're not overly involved in or overly intrusive from a day-to-day standpoint, and I'll talk more about that and the reasons for that. The other one important takeaway is you have one employee. That employee is Dr. Macri. You do not employ anyone else in the school district. You only have the legal authority to employ Dr. Macri. Everything else then has a hierarchical nature that flows from Dr. Macri, right? So then Dr. Macri, she overviews and evaluates your administrative staff overviews, evaluates your teachers, so on and so on. Now that doesn't mean that you may not have a policy that says you can be part of the hiring of certified teachers or certified administrators, but the only employee that you are legally allowed to evaluate is Dr. Macri. She, under 10-157, is the chief executive officer of the board, which means she's responsible for the day-to-day operational pieces. If you wanted to know, for instance, the evaluations, so let's say you as a Board of Education member, and I've had some Board of Education members run because they've been frustrated with, let's say, how an administrator's handled something, and you want to see the evaluation of that administrator now that you're a Board of Education member. Do you legally have the right to see that? I do not, right? So not only do you not evaluate an administrator, but just because you are a Board of Education member does not mean that you even have the legal right to see, let's say, the evaluation of our Director of Student Services. And that's because there's a very specific provision under the law that says certified teachers, certified administrators, their evaluations are not subject to disclosure unless they give express authorization. Now, if you wanted, obviously, you're the authors of Dr. Macri's evaluation. You have an affirmative legal obligation once a year to evaluate your superintendent of schools, and that is built into statute in 10-157. So that's an affirmative obligation. A few other things I wanted to talk about. Your duties of board members. Your obligation to preserve confidentiality. So, let's say in a student proceeding, okay, you have a student expulsion proceeding that may be coming before you. You as Board of Education members, and this is just a hypothetical, so I'm not talking about anything specific. This is something that potentially maybe has generated a lot of publicity, and you want to know information because you have a lot of parents calling you and you want to be able to assure parents or calm parents. You cannot share that information with parents. Not only can you not share that information with parents, but really it's not appropriate for the administration to really share any information with you prior to a disciplinary proceeding, because you have to sit as judge and jury in that disciplinary proceeding. And students have due process rights just like our employees do. And if we share too much information with you prior to an expulsion proceeding, and that is found out through a request of records or even a subpoena of records, that child is going to be able to make the argument that I wasn't given the due process that I'm entitled to under the law because the Board of Education members who sit as judge and jury in this hearing knew everything going in and did not go in with an open mind. My fate had been preordained. So we have to be very mindful of that. Now, the information that we might also receive in that executive session and in that student matter, we then cannot, when we leave, share any of that information, even though people are going to want to ask you those questions. We have to be very careful because if we violate the student's confidentiality rights, and I'm sure many of you have heard of FERPA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, there is exposure for the school district. So we want to be very mindful of that. Other confidentiality issues with respect to employees I'll talk about in the next slide. But I just want to focus on, I know we talked about policies, some of your statutory duties. So I know that you were given a presentation by your Board of Finance today. So obviously the budget is going to be one of the most significant things you will do every year as a Board of Education. The entity here who makes appropriations, and I don't know in Cromwell whether that's your Board of Finance or whether that's your town council who issues the appropriation to you. But once they do that, you have great fiscal autonomy. So once you receive the appropriation, they don't get to earmark that money. You have complete fiscal autonomy as to how that money is spent. So again, that's a pretty incredible, awesome responsibility that you have. The other thing is negotiations. So I know many of you have been part of the negotiation process with us, Dipti, Jen, Selena, Catherine. You also have to remember, and I know some of you also work in the public school context, but all of your staff, with the exception of really Dr. Macri and a few central office people, are unionized, right? Connecticut gives extensive protections to our unions, and we have to be mindful of that as Board of Education members, and we have to honor and preserve those rights. So most everything that you do with your employees and their terms and conditions of employment is going to be governed by the contract. It's important that we're familiar with those contracts, and it's important that we understand that we don't have the authority to just summarily discharge people. So sometimes Board of Education members, in my experience, may get frustrated with a superintendent because they say, you know, there's been a lot of complaints about this administrator or about this teacher. I'm not pleased with them. But you have to understand that teachers and administrators, particularly through 10-151, which is also in addition to the contract that governs their terms and conditions of employment, have extensive rights. And once a teacher's tenured, we can't just summarily discharge them. And so we have to be mindful of Board of Education members that there are processes and protocols in place before we can just effectively separate ties with certified staff members. Same thing for some of our non-certified staff members, or for most of them. The contract would govern their terms and conditions of employment, and there are going to be protocols and procedures that Dr. Macri and her colleagues are going to have to follow. So one thing I did want to emphasize, and I do get this question a lot, particularly for some of our new board members. I'm sure some of you are parents, or you may have other loved ones in the community. You do not shed your ability to advocate on behalf of your children just because you're Board of Education members. You certainly still have the right to be a parent and advocate on behalf of your children. Where we want to be very careful is, though, we're not using our position to advantage ourselves or to advantage our students. Now, about 8 to 10 years ago, I was very heavily involved in a very complicated ethics issue where a board member had worked closely with a superintendent of schools and had used her influence to try to change her students' grades, which led to a catastrophe, you can imagine, town-wise, but also years of having to litigate an ethics complaint. Obviously, it rocked the community, and it was a huge scandal. And it all stemmed from the fact that a board member, and I know that this wouldn't happen here, but I'm just using it as an example because it is a live example, felt very strongly that because she was a board member, that her children should be given that advantage. And so you probably also, through your town charter, have ethic provisions that are applicable to you, and we want to be mindful about that as Board of Education members. The other thing that we want to be mindful of is even when you're in a conversation, so you as a parent, let's say, and I had the situation happen last year with a board member, she was not pleased with the way the high school principal handled something with her son. Her son had medical issues, and I will admit, he did not handle it very well. She had every right as a parent to go to that high school principal and say, you're not complying with the 504 accommodations that my son is entitled to. You have dropped the ball. You and your staff have dropped the ball. She absolutely had merit to her claim. The problem is, then she says, and just wait until I let the board members know. Just wait. So what do you think happened? So the problem with that is, not only did that administrator take that as somewhat of a threat, but as I said before, the only person you evaluate is Dr. Macri. So she not only doesn't have the right to evaluate him, she doesn't have the right to make threats or claims like that, but also she doesn't have the right to talk about the performance of an administrator with the full Board of Education. We'll talk a little bit about the executive session privilege and when we can talk about the performance of employees. So that administrator filed a labor board charge against that board member saying you have, abused your position here and basically made a harassment complaint and said that he'd been subjected now to an unwelcoming and hostile environment. Now, we were able to work that out, but again, it cost money to litigate, and it was certainly not something that helped with the relationship between the administrative staff and the Board of Education. So I say that not that I think that any of you would engage in that behavior, but we just want to be mindful that even if we don't say things like that, when you walk into a room, even though you technically are not, quote, their boss, Dr. Macri is, they don't necessarily know that. They don't know everything that we're talking about here, and they view you that way. And so we just need to be very cognizant when we're meeting with people, even if it's in our capacity as a parent or as a community member. Same thing with our First Amendment rights. You don't shed your First Amendment rights. You still have the right. If Dipti wants to go on social media and she wants to make a comment about something related to the Cromwell community, she has the right to do that. We can't tell her she can't do it. I believe that you enacted a social media policy for board members, because I think we had talked about that a few years ago with Mr. Camilleri. And if you haven't, we could certainly talk about that again. But that, again, doesn't infringe on your right to go on social media, to make comments that you have a right to make comments about. But it does say that my comments can't be disruptive of the educational process or be hateful in any regard. And so sometimes boards of ed have adopted that policy just to remind people that they have to be very careful when they go on social media too. The other thing is, if you are going to go on social media and you do feel compelled to say something, you want to make sure that you are saying it, I'm saying it as Selena Kelleher, not on behalf of the Board of Education, but I, the individual, as Selena Kelleher, am saying this on social media about something in Cromwell. Now, this is not a giving you blanket permission to just go on social media and say things we shouldn't be saying. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think it's important that you understand that you still can go on social media. You still can be an active community member. You just have to think twice about, remember what your role is now that you're a Board of Education member. Normally when a Board of Ed wants to speak collectively, what you really have to do, because we speak through our chairperson, so when we're talking about the role of the chair, our chairperson is really the liaison between the board and Dr. Macri. And so normally, and how it's always been here in Cromwell, is that we follow that protocol because we don't want Dr. Macri to answer to 9 different people. We want a flow of communication between Selena and Dr. Macri. But we also, if we wanted to issue a statement, and a few years ago I worked with some of you on this board, we needed to issue some statements related to some very significant personnel matters that were, highly generated a lot of press. And if you recall how we did that, Selena, we met in executive session with an attorney-client communication. We talked about what the appropriate position or statement from the board would be. And then the board authorized Mike Camilleri to issue that statement on behalf of the board. And so when you want to speak as an entity, that is the appropriate way to do it, because we don't have the right as individuals to speak for the entity. Okay, so I talked a lot about the confidentiality. I just wanted to also mention, so we talked about students and their due process rights and why we have to preserve confidentiality. We also have to be mindful in the personnel capacity. And I say that because if Dr. Macri issues a written reprimand to a custodian or to a paraprofessional or to a teacher, and they challenge that, which they have the right under their collective bargaining agreement, which we just talked about, how they're all unionized staff members, that grievance process in the contract makes it very clear that if they don't like the decision Dr. Macri made, they come to the Board of Ed, and it's up to you whether you're going to sustain or deny the discipline, because you sit as judge and jury. Now, we've had a few of those here, probably in the last 5 or 6 years. Maybe you've had 3 or 4 of those. And again, that employee can say, well, if I know that Selena and Dipti, called other teachers or had conversations in the grocery store about this issue, how am I going to get the due process that I'm entitled to at this grievance hearing? It's even more pronounced when we're talking about the termination or the non-renewal of a teacher, because they have a very specific statutory process that not only gives them a right to be heard before you, but before that, they have the right to an arbitration should they challenge the termination proceeding. And then it's up to the Board of Ed whether or not you're ultimately going to terminate that teacher. If you have reviewed the personnel file, if you know way too much about the case, that teacher's going to be able to make a claim that they couldn't get a fair trial before the Board of Education. And then you otherwise could end up in years of litigation, like I've seen happen in some other districts, or otherwise having to hold on to a teacher or an administrator that you otherwise would not have wanted to have held on to.
When we have issues that come up pretty much under where it says we have to be an impartial judge, a lot of times we as parents are, and most of us have students here, or just even the small town nature that we live in, we know a lot of information because small towns talk. So how do we maintain the impartial judge when there's a lot happening, especially if our kids are in a particular school where things may be happening related to teachers or any of the other things listed under impartial judge?
So you maintain the impartial judge by, so let's say in a student issue. It doesn't mean that, yes, it's a very small community. It doesn't mean you may not be told information from your children or things may not be shared with you. But you have an obligation if someone comes up to you and starts talking to you about this in the grocery store, at a cocktail party, to say, I cannot talk about this. I know I'm a Board of Education member. I know you want to talk to me about this, but I have a legal obligation to preserve the confidentiality. It's not okay for me to talk about this. Or if it is an issue about a teacher, I properly refer that to the administration because it's not within your purview. So you have to really go on record saying that. If we engage in the conversation, we can't help that people might share information with us or send us an email. It's what we do in response that I'm concerned about. So if we engage and we ask for more information or we actively solicit information, that's going to be problematic. But if, Catherine, your kids come home and tell you something, that to me is not the same thing because, one, you're not soliciting the information, you're not involving yourself in the incident, you're not calling Dr. Macri to demand the head of that teacher, demand the head of that administrator. So you can walk into a hearing and you can be guided by your moral compass to say, yes, it's a small town. I may have heard some rumblings, but I know I can sit here impartially, and I know I rejected people trying to talk to me about this, and I didn't go out of my way to solicit further information. So that's really the balance there. Certainly if we go on social media and we say, this teacher is ineffective, that's going to be problematic.
Just quickly, I don't want to wait until the next board meeting to say this, and some people do actually watch, but obviously we've been dealing with an incident lately, and I met with a group of students this morning, and right out of the mouths of babes, I couldn't have paid them to say this, but they said to me, we are so scared. Can you help us figure out a way to stop the parents from talking about stuff on social media? Because they're not the ones that have to come here every day. We are. So they're reading things on social media, and that is making them more afraid. And what really infuriates them, which I saw today, was when it's a parent that isn't at that grade level, or if it's a community member, obviously, that doesn't have any kids in the district. They asked me for help today on how, and I said to them, you could help me educate the adults on how it affects you, because so many things, because of privacy and confidentiality, we can't say it. And it's, believe me, it's difficult for everybody. But the kids then, if they're listening to some of the parents and they're watching those comments, they're now more afraid than they were in the first place. So that was pretty interesting to hear right from children this morning. students, and I say children, I'm talking about sophomores, juniors, seniors, who I just give so much credit to because it came right out of their mouths. So social media could be great, and it also can be so dangerous. And there isn't anyone that you can't refer to me that I'm not going to talk to. I will talk to everyone. But being cognizant, I think we've got so caught up as adults that of how it affects us, that it really affects them. And they're the ones who are here every single day. And that was just so powerful for me to hear today. So I'm glad I had this came up because I have the opportunity to share it with you and whoever's listening. Is let's help the kids feel better about things and go through the proper channels. Social media is not it.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. One other social media example that I'll give you. We had a situation with a superintendent where things had gotten very difficult, and it was clear that it was time to part ways with the superintendent. In the executive session, we were discussing with the Board of Ed the settlement agreement that we had been negotiating with the superintendent. The community was going crazy. So to Dr. Macri's point, parents, community members, just all over the internet saying, what are these board members going to do? The superintendent is toxic. The superintendent needs to go. What are they doing? But it was incessant, okay? So, yes, you are elected officials, and sometimes you will feel the weight of that. And I understand that this board member really felt the weight and the pressure of that. But what he did was he took to social media and said, I promise all of you, I assure all of you right now, we are in the middle of settlement negotiations, which no one knew. No one knew that. We are in the middle of settlement negotiations. She's going to resign. Everything's going to be fine. What do we think happened after that happened? I'll tell you this. So, right. So not only was he admonished by his fellow board members, but let me just tell you, we paid a lot more to get that superintendent to go than we were before he wrote that. A lot more. Because now she was able to say, you had an obligation to preserve that confidentiality. This is potentially defamation of my character. She wouldn't have won on that argument, but these are the things that her lawyers are now saying. And so they probably spent close to $200,000 more than they wanted to get rid of that superintendent who needed to go. It was time for that superintendent to go because of that comment. So that's why, to Dr. Macri's point, it isn't that he couldn't have said, thank you for your comments. We care about this community, or something very general if he really felt he had to say something. But to give specifics like that, extremely problematic. Yeah.
Can I just ask you a quick question? Going back to the chair expressing anything on Facebook, you had mentioned in the past we've done that through our former chairperson when we came to an agreement on what was to be said. Is it safe to say that it's that wouldn't need to happen if we just shared something that was formally already written by the district and we're just sharing it as information?
Yeah, so what I was specifically talking about is when you make a comment as a board. Remember, a couple years ago, you had that very significant personnel matter. We didn't want any board members to go rogue and make comments on that very specific personnel matter, but you had the community and the press saying, what are you going to tell me about this? So that's when we collectively came together and we issued a statement on behalf of the full board. If you're talking about the Board of Ed approved, $300,000 in reading grants, and this happened at the meeting, and you want to Twitter that, or you want to just repeat or reaffirm that happened at the board member, I don't have a problem with that.
Okay.
That's perfectly fine. So that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
There are things that are appropriate for you to do on social media. What I wouldn't want to see happen is you saying the board approved $300,000 in reading grants. It was a 6-3 vote. I was one of the 3, and I'm bombasting or lambasting the rest of my board members who approved the motion. That I wouldn't want to see, right? But certainly if you just want to reaffirm, or this is what transpired at this meeting, perfectly appropriate. And social media, I know, can be an effective tool. right? It can be an effective tool to be in touch with our community members. Well, but there are some positives for it. So I don't, clearly in Dr. Macri's situation, clearly in my example, not positive, but there can be some positives. We just have to find the right balance. Okay, so here's our first scenario. So using your clickers. So yesterday, the local newspaper published a front page story about a teacher employed by the district who was arrested for running a meth lab. The article identifies the teacher by name and school. Parents from that school come to the next board meeting, and during public comment, several of them address the board to express concern that the teacher has to be fired immediately. So the question is, you have a fourth parent who comes up to speak, attack the board for sitting there like bumps on a log, and asks the board members what they're going to do about this terrible teacher. So the question is, can a board member reassure the public that the board will fire this teacher if he is guilty as charged? A, yes, B, no. Okay, good. I actually got a few yeses on this last night. So, good. And why can't we do that? Right. So that's the first point. Excellent. And what was your name? Kelly. Nice to meet you, Kelly. And is there a second reason why? Yeah. One you only see over, so right, so you can't assure that. But remember, Catherine, were you? But also, so let's say Dr. Well, that's exactly right. And so remember, so let's say Dr. Macri wants to terminate this teacher. We initiate the termination proceedings. We first have to go to an arbitrator before any of you are even involved. The arbitrator is going to issue a decision. That decision is going to be given to you. You can either agree with the arbitrator or not agree with the arbitrator. But if you've all gone on record at a meeting, are you a 7 or a 9 member board? So let's say 7 of the 9 of you go on record at a board meeting saying, we'll get him gone, don't worry about it. Well, then only 2 of you can sit in the hearing to determine whether or not you should approve or not approve the arbitrator's decision. So that teacher in this example will have significant due process claims that he can make to say, here's the recording of that meeting where 7 of these board members said, off with my head. There's no way I'm going to get a fair hearing before the Board of Education. And he's either going to tie you up in lawsuits, or it might render it almost impossible to continue with the process. So remember, we just want to be mindful. You sit as the impartial judge, the judge and jury. We cannot get involved in these personnel matters. We have to be very careful about what we say. We also, what's another thing we don't want to ever do at a public meeting, like they're doing here? Not only make promises, Jen, but they're engaging in dialogue, right? We don't do that at board meetings, right? There is public comment. We listen. We take it under advisement. We certainly can, reward our students and say wonderful things about our students and our community members, but we don't engage in a dialogue with the public comment. Okay, here's another scenario. So a board member is Facebook friends with a teacher. In a post on her Facebook page, the teacher complains that her principal unfairly denied her 3 days of personal leave to attend Nature's classroom in a neighboring school district to serve as a chaperone for her 5th grade son. The board member calls the principal to find out what the problem is. The teacher files a grievance, which is denied at the lower steps and is now before the board. Don't worry about the question. The question really is, can the board member participate in the grievance hearing? That's the question. Don't worry about the or and the after, because it's a double negative and I need to fix it. So the question is, can the board member participate in the grievance hearing? What do you think? Okay. And I'm sorry, what was your name? Matt, nice to meet you. So you raise a good question. Can they or should they? The reason why I say can is because if I got a call and I found out that that had happened, I would say absolutely not. That board member has to recuse themselves, because I would be very worried about the due process issues, potentially ethical or labor board charge. So you're right. The question would be, should they? And obviously, if Selena called me on that, I would say, Selena, they absolutely should not. Selena does have the authority as chair to tell them that they cannot come and serve on that grievance committee. And so, I mean, I really view this as kind of a black and white answer, because should they? They should not. But I would even take it further to say they cannot, based on that behavior, because that will lead potentially to problems. Sure, absolutely. What do you want me to go back to? So it's a Facebook post, but they reached out to the principal and called them to say, what's going on here? Right? Totally fine. Now, if we like it, unlike it, do emoji, heart, yeah, something like that. Again, I'm worried, maybe to Matt's point, that's a should they. If I give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, maybe that's a should they. But when I call the principal to find out more about it, they absolutely cannot participate. Of course. Right. And again, in the scenario that I was talking to you about with the board member who was worried about the way the 504 was being implemented, well, that principal did file a labor charge against that Board of Education member. Okay. So let's just switch gears a little bit to board meeting essentials. So freedom of information. So how many feel that they're very well versed in the freedom of information laws? Matt, better than average. Okay, I like it. How about everyone else? Okay, average. Why do we care about FOI? That's exactly right. Yeah, it can generate 30,000 documents from a search like that. Yeah, so everything Matt is saying is absolutely correct. So let me say this about the freedom of information. You are a Board of Ed. You are a public agency. Everything you do is available for public consumption unless it falls into a very, very narrow exception, which I'll talk a little bit about. So that means, to Matt's point, you cannot hide behind your Gmail. You cannot hide behind your personal phone. If you are engaging in business that is under the purview of this Board of Ed, and those records are requested, you have an affirmative obligation under the Freedom of Information to do your due diligence, to hand those over to Dr. Macri or to your legal counsel, whoever's running the show on that. If you don't, and I've had this happen, and there's evidence that there are responsive documents on your personal email address, your personal phone, they can be subpoenaed. And I've also had to go down to the commission with a very, very upset Board of Education member whose phone records were subpoenaed and whose personal Gmail account was subpoenaed. Now think about this too. If I'm that board member who is acting against the advice of my counsel and not providing that, we don't have to, as a Board of Education, indemnify that difficult Board of Education member, because what that Board of Education member is saying, I'm acting recklessly, I'm not acting within the scope of my duty, I'm acting against the advice of legal counsel, and I'm doing everything contrary to what the rest of the entity is doing. So you could also potentially be individually liable for any potential outcome or catastrophes that could follow. And you may have to get your own lawyer and your own counsel and have to pay for that out of your own pocket. So that doesn't happen a lot, but it can. And I say that because we have the most extensive freedom of information laws in the entire country. So it's very rare that the commission is going to say something is not subject to disclosure, again, unless it falls into one of these very narrow exceptions. But everything you do is public. So we want to be mindful, and we'll talk about email communications not triggering an illegal meeting under FOIA, meaning that the communication has been among a quorum of our board members or even a subcommittee of our board members. So we want to be mindful about that, right? But even if it doesn't trigger an obligation to post for a meeting because it isn't a communication among a quorum or it isn't a communication among our policy committee with a matter under our purview, it's still subject to disclosure. To Matt's point, if someone requests, I want every single correspondence between Board of Education members over the last year. We also don't want to put anything in writing that we wouldn't want the public, the community, the press to see. And sometimes it is, I will say that I had a due process issue. Now, this wasn't necessarily with our Board of Education members, but it was with some of our teachers who are also subject to these freedom of information laws, right? Where the lawyer involved in the due process case subpoenaed every single correspondence between these 3 or 4 teachers. They had to hand them over. This wasn't just a FOIA request. Now, remember, if we withhold these documents or if we're challenged on some of these documents, they can also be lawfully and legally subpoenaed, or if we're being sued over something, they can also be subpoenaed throughout the court process. So here, through the subpoena, we had to hand over records that made it very clear that these teachers said very disparaging things about the student who was the subject of the due process hearing. That was probably the most costly subpoena. And then we ended up having to pay a $300,000 outplacement for 3 years for this child just because we had to disclose those records. So I say that, and this does not happen a lot. And so I have faith in everyone. I just say, don't put it in writing if you don't need to. Really think twice about that. Because remember, anyone can have access to that. Okay, so just to define a meeting, as we talked about, so it's the convening or the assembly of a quorum of your agency. So if you're 9, a quorum is 5. But your subcommittees are also subject to FOIA, right? So if you have an executive committee, if you have a policy committee, if you have a negotiations committee is separate because that's an exception. But you also have to post for those meetings. And so we have to be cognizant of that if my subcommittee, my policy meeting is going to meet, I have to post for that. It also talks about, so any communication by or to a quorum of that agency, whether that's in person or means of the electronic equipment, which is why your Gmails and your text messages come into play because of the definition of meeting, and you're discussing or acting upon a matter that you have purview or jurisdiction over. Okay, what does a meeting not include? So under the law, these are known as non-meetings. A meeting of a personnel search committee. So when you went to hire Dr. Macri, for those of you who were involved in that process, and I assisted you through that process, we named the entire board members of the personnel search committee through a motion in open session, which meant that every single Board of Education member could go to every meeting with every candidate, could meet with the third-party entity that you hired to guide you through that process, could meet with me to ask questions without having to post for it. The other reason why we do that too is because you might have candidates that come in and out. The unsuccessful candidates, we don't want to have to post that and potentially, impact their livelihood for the ones who aren't getting the job. So that's part of the rationale for that. A chance or social meeting. So you might all have kids on the basketball team. You might go to the basketball game. That's totally fine. You can hang out, you can sit with each other at the basketball game. But if you use that opportunity to discuss board business or to essentially take action, meaning we all know what everyone's thinking about this one issue, that's going to be problematic. And again, if people find that out, that could subject you to a FOIA complaint. Collective bargaining. I'm sorry, yes. They don't. They don't. But doesn't mean they can't file a complaint. Then I got to drag you down to Hartford, and I have to have you testify as to what you were talking about. Every single person who's there. So I'm not saying everyone does this, but you do sometimes have these few, 2 or 3. I'll tell you, the Freedom of Information complaints that Matt's talking about, the $25,000 to $35,000 per complaint, is normally the same 3 people in each community that are responsible for you incurring that kind of cost. So it doesn't happen a lot, but let's say if you have a few people who overhear what you're discussing, and there's a question about whether or not you were discussing something related to a textbook, and that person felt that you had discussed and decided what you were going to do with respect to that textbook. They could file a complaint, and then we just have to go through the process, right? And so it might be that there's nothing to it, but I still have to drag you down to the commission, have you testify as to what you spoke to, right? Negotiations, collective bargaining, we don't have to post for that. That's all by definition a non-meeting. So anytime we sit down with our nurses, our paras, even if we have a quorum or a subcommittee of the board, we don't have to post for that. Now, a caucus member of a single political party. So this means that for any of you who are registered as Republicans, you can all meet together without posting. Any of you who are all registered as Democrats, you can all meet together without posting. If you have some independents on the board, they can register to be part of a caucus with one party or the other, as long as that's registered with the town clerk, and then you would be able to go into that political caucus without that being a problem. If, however, let's say your Republican caucus invites the Board of Finance chair or the Republican town committee member to join your caucus, you have waived that privilege. That is not a caucus, because that person is not on the Board of Ed. Yeah. So let's say I'm part of the Republican Party, okay? Let's say there's 5 of you. You're all entitled to caucus together, no posting, no notice. If you invite Dr. Macri to that meeting, if you invite me, if you invite a Board of Finance member, if you invite the Republican Town Committee chairperson, you have waived the privilege to caucus because they are not part of your board. The other question I get a lot too is, okay, I'm in my caucus. We share documents in that caucus. Well, my caucus is private, but are those documents private? They're not, unless they fall under a very narrow exception. Anything you share or create in that caucus is potentially subject to disclosure. So sometimes people feel protected in the caucus, but just know that what is shared in that caucus, physically shared, right, a communication, can be subject to disclosure. So real quick, I think this is probably review for most of you. You have 3 types of meetings: your regular, your special, your emergency. We know that our regular meetings are filed well in advance with our town clerk. Our special meetings, like tonight, have to be posted along with our regular meetings 24 hours in advance. If you're holding all remote meetings, the laws have changed a little bit. I don't think you're doing that, though. If they do, the laws have changed a little bit in that you'd have to post at least 48 hours in advance, because you have to give someone who wants access to electronic equipment or to participate in live time, they have to give you 24 hours notice that they want to be able to do that. And so in essence, you'd have to post that 48 hours in advance. Emergency meetings, you don't have to post. You do, however, within 72 hours have to justify why you held the emergency meeting. The only time I've ever heard or seen the Freedom of Information Commission uphold an emergency meeting is after Newtown. So you are just better off waiting 24 hours and posting the meeting within 24 hours. Okay, on regular meetings, so tonight's a special meeting. Let's say Selena now says to you, I really want to discuss, whether or not we're going to approve the 7th grade curriculum. I want to add a motion to do that. Can she do that at tonight's meeting? Dipti, you're shaking your head. So, we're in a special meeting right now. So the distinction is, because we're in a special meeting, we can't add new business items. So Selena could not do that tonight. But if we were in a regular meeting and she said, oh, I forgot to put this on the agenda, or there was some discussion that had triggered the desire to put something else on the agenda, if you have 2/3 vote, you can do that at a regular meeting, even if it's not on the agenda. At a special meeting, you are not legally able to do that. It has to be only business that's on the agenda. So that's the distinction between those two meetings. Two-thirds of those present and voting. Yep. Great question, Kelly. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about conducting meetings. So here's another scenario. So I have a board member malcontent. He's been causing issues for the Nutmeg board. During meetings, he would often verbally attack the motives of other members and staff, and it was suspected that he leaked information from an executive session, which we know we cannot do. He would visit school buildings unannounced, demanding to be able to visit classrooms to check on underperforming teachers. But the last straw for the board was when he voted to approve the new teacher's contract, even though his wife was a teacher in the district. In a special meeting where Mal was not in attendance, they voted 8-0 to kick him off the board. So the question is, which statement is correct using your responders? A board member never can vote on his or her spouse's contract. The board member should not be serving on the board because his spouse is a district employee. The board's vote to remove the member from the board was invalid since the member was not in attendance, or 4, none of the above. Okay. Anyone want to share? Yeah, Dipti. Well, that's exactly right. So none of the above is the answer I would have gone with too. So, yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I said only 3. And now a board member never can vote on his or her spouse's contract. They shouldn't. They should recuse themselves or abstain.
That's why it's not correct. Because the reason why we built it in that way is because it's a little tricky. If you called me and said, my spouse is in the district, I would say, don't vote on it because you can gain a financial benefit from approving the 2% general wage increase or the lower premium contribution. And potentially, an ethics violation could be filed, right? Because you are gaining a financial benefit. But it doesn't mean you can't vote. The teacher's contract may be part of the entire budget. It doesn't mean you can't vote on the entire budget, which in essence and theoretically would also be voting on their contract because you'd be approving the full budget, which also approves the increases. So that's why it's written that way. It's a little tricky. So that's why I'd go with none of the above. But I would not advise that you do that. Right. But theoretically, never is not correct because you can vote on the budget at large, which incorporates those increases. Yeah, I got it. That one's tricky, I know. But the thing, to Dipti's point, so it's pretty incredible. I've had Board of Education members be arrested for outrageous conduct, flee to Jamaica, never to be heard again for about 6 weeks. Oh, yeah. And this was in my hometown. And my friend was married to him. So it was really interesting. Yes, this was about probably 7 or 8 years ago in West Hartford. Hilarious. Very smart guy, too, but kind of lost it a little bit. And the town committee was like, why is this guy still on the board? What can we do? How can we get him off the board? And we said, there's nothing you can do. Only the constituents can vote him out or he can resign. And I recognize that he's under arrest and he has fled to Jamaica and he's probably doing God knows what there, but there's nothing we can do about it. Now, he ultimately resigned, but you don't have the legal authority to kick a board member off this board. Now, your chairperson has a lot of power, though, with a very difficult board member. You can strip them of all committee assignments. If the person in question were a vice chair, you could potentially strip them of their vice chair status. You can censure them. Now, the censuring process through Robert's Rules is really just an admonishment, but it's pretty embarrassing. And ultimately, the threat of having to go through the censure process might be enough for most board members to resign, because it's pretty embarrassing, pretty difficult to have to go through all of that. And potentially, they could be subjected to an investigation before you even went through that process. And so I've seen that being a very effective way to get these unruly board members to resign. So you have some leverage, but you cannot kick them out of office. The other thing, too, is perfectly fine if you work here and so does your spouse. Just remember, I wouldn't vote on their contract. So if your spouse is a custodian or paraprofessional, I would not vote on their contract. But you cannot, statutorily, you are prohibited from working here and being a Board of Education member. Okay, so we talked about that. Okay, executive session. So I know you had an executive session today on negotiations. Perfectly appropriate executive session. I would say if there's anything under the Freedom of Information law that is more violated anywhere, it's the use of executive session. All right, so let's test you out on this. So Matt, I know you said you're above average. If you get this question right, you are like top of the charts. All right. So the Nutmeg Board is in a special budget meeting when it learns of dire economic news that meant significant staffing cuts were necessary. So knowing that the board would need to discuss and decide the elimination of specific positions and not wishing to distress or excite employees, the chair adds an executive session item to the agenda to discuss, quote, personnel matters. With a 5-3 vote, the board enters executive session. After an hour of discussion, the board members agree, without a vote, to direct the superintendent to cut 10 staffing positions. So far, so good. So read this carefully, because the question is, which statement is incorrect? So which statement is false? The board's agenda must state that the board will go into executive session. 2, a vote to go into executive session must be by 2/3. 3, stating that the reason for executive session was for personnel reasons is insufficient. Or 4, the board cannot add an item to the agenda during a special meeting of the board. So again, which statement is not true? Using your clickers. So in other words, Catherine, which statement is false? Okay. See, I love it. This is like one of the toughest questions. Anyone want to share? Wait, there's harder ones than this? Well, this is probably the toughest question. This is probably the toughest question in the presentation. What do we think? Yeah, Dipti. So you're right in that number 3 is correct, But the question is, what's incorrect? But you are 100% right. So to Dipty's point, number 3 is not the right answer to the question, but she's right in saying that number 3 is incorrect, right? Is correct. Excuse me. She's right in saying that number 3 is correct. No, number 3 is correct because it's insufficient to just put personnel reasons. So you were right, Dipty, but you were right. It's just not the right answer to this question, but you're right in saying that you can't, okay. One of the executive session privileges is to discuss the performance, the employment, the appointment, or the dismissal of a public officer or public employee. That's it. So there is no, I can just go into executive session for personnel reasons to discuss the desire to cut 10 staffing positions, because I'm not talking about the discussion of the superintendent's contract, the discussion of a teacher's request for leave, the discussion of, our director of student services employment contract or employment status, You're trying to use it here to discuss something that's personnel related, but it's not specific to any individual. That's number 3. Okay, so number 2, so that's correct. So number 2 is correct. You have to have 2/3 to go into executive session. Number 1 is incorrect. Correct, because you don't ever legally have to state on an agenda that we are going into executive session. You never have to tell anyone that. There's no legal requirement. There's no requirement under Robert's Rules, freedom of information. We normally do because it's a professional courtesy or a courtesy to our members of the public that you're going to have to leave the room for 20 minutes to an hour because we're going into executive session. But what I always recommend on the agenda, so let's say the agenda is discussion concerning the superintendent's contract, which is an appropriate personnel exception, but you say proposed for executive session for 2 reasons. 1, you don't know if you have the votes, right? Theoretically, you have to get the votes at the meeting, so you can't assume you have 2/3 vote to go in executive session. Normally you do, but as we've seen with malcontent, we can have very disgruntled and difficult board members. The other thing too is Dr. Macri, if I'm discussing her performance, she has the right to know at least 48 hours in advance before you do that. And she has the right to tell you, I want that discussion in open session. Now, she can't demand that she's in your executive session. So if she declines the open session, you can have the meeting without her in the executive session, but she can demand that your conversation be held in open session. So that's why we have to be cognizant of that. And then number 4, we know is correct because we know we cannot add an item to the agenda at a special meeting, only at a regular meeting. Any questions about this? Yeah. Has to be for a very specific reason, though. And I'll get into the reason. So, yes, and we wouldn't normally, but it can't be about a personnel matter because you have to give that person 48 hours notice. So it couldn't be that. But, if you wanted to discuss in executive session a collective bargaining strategy with respect to, the paras contract that you just did, if it wasn't on the agenda, doesn't mean that it's futile and that there's nothing you can do about it. Selena can ask for a motion to go into executive session for the purposes of discussing the contract negotiations between the board and the para, even if it's not on the agenda. If it's not in the agenda. So I'm not saying, no. The executive session is a status of the meeting. It's not an agenda item. So I'm not suggesting that you don't put it on the agenda. What I'm saying is it's not legally required. An executive session is a status of a meeting. So for tonight, if you had discussion concerning the collective bargaining strategy between the paras and the board, and then possible action, and you forgot in the discussion part to put proposed for executive session, it doesn't matter. Selena can still call for a motion to go into executive session. provided she gets 2/3 vote, special meeting, regular meeting, because it's not an agenda item, it's a status of the meeting. There's a legal distinction, right? Because the public has still been put on notice. I'm discussing the collective bargaining agreement, so that's fine. We don't have to put them on notice we're going into executive session. Right. Now, I would always put in parentheses, proposed for executive session. But the question is, do you legally have to do that? No. But I don't recommend saying executive session to discuss, because you don't know if you have the votes. It's always a proposed executive session, because you first need the votes before you can go in. Right? We never want to look like we've preordained a vote. So that's the legal significance there. Yeah. Yep. So, okay. So, it's not listed here. So, what defines personnel is specifically? So, a contract, superintendent's contract, that's going to be a personnel matter. Because if you look at the Freedom of Information law, it specifically gives you the privilege for executive session for the discussion concerning the performance, the appointment, the dismissal, the employment of a public official or an employee of the school district. That is the only legitimate reason for a personnel exception. It has to specifically be about an individual. That's why that individual has to be given 48 hours notice. Now, again, you don't have the right to discuss the performance of an administrator legally. So really, the only time this is really going to come into play for you is when you're discussing Dr. Macri's contract, or I was here at a meeting a few months ago where you were discussing other non-affiliated contracts. You may have a teacher, though, who requests a medical leave and the contract requires that request to come to the Board of Ed. That would be another personnel, because you're discussing the employment status or the request of an employee regarding her status in executive session. But this is why this is violated all the time. And I go to so many meetings where it says executive session regarding personnel matters. And people just talk about whatever they want to talk about with respect to what goes on in the school district, but it is an illegal executive session. The reason why we care about this is if you come out and take action and everything, it's kind of like the fruit of the poisonous tree under criminal law. So if everything leading up to the vote is done illegally and not in compliance with FOI, and someone challenges it, not only under FOI can you be fined, but they can null and void the action you took, which is an awesome power that that commission has. So they ultimately can reverse a decision that you made because you did not comply with FOI. Now, you always have the ability to later rectify that, but people may have a change of heart in the way that they voted, and you always have the right to do that, right? A motion to rescind at a later meeting. And so things could get complicated. And of course, we don't want to spend the money to have to go through that. Okay, so that's personnel matters. Very, very specific. So to your question, and I'm sorry, what was your name? Alan. Nice to meet you, Alan. So your question, you voted on a contract. Well, that is a collective bargaining strategy that's perfectly appropriate for executive session. But it doesn't fall under personnel, it falls under collective bargaining strategy. So that's why that was appropriate. The other reasons are pending claims and litigation. If you're sued, someone files a discrimination complaint against you, you have every right to discuss that in executive session. But you actually have to have been served. It can't be the threat of a lawsuit. And you still have to put on the agenda the claim number. So we wouldn't want to identify the parents, we wouldn't want to identify the employee, but we'd have to put the claim number. You can't just say a pending claim. Security devices in real estate. So this is really interesting. So you can legitimately have an executive session if you want to discuss, and a lot of school districts are discussing this, your safety plans, where you put the cameras, other, safety measures that you have in place. The crazy thing is, though, if I request and I say, I want to see everything that was discussed in that executive session, and I want to know where all the cameras are, I, as a member of the public, you can't just say no to me, right? You would think, okay, clearly I shouldn't have to share those confidential documents that could compromise safety, you first have to go to DEEP, which is an acronym for the Department of Environmental Emergency Protection. I'm not getting that right, but something to that effect. You have to tell them why you don't want to disclose those documents and why it would compromise security and safety. Then they have to give you permission to not disclose them. Crazy. Makes absolutely no sense. But you don't have the legal right to withhold that information until they tell you you can. So I just want people, I know, it makes no sense. It makes you can go into executive session without permission. Well, it's environmental, that's what I'm saying. It's something, Department of Emergency something, right? So that's why I'm botching it. But the acronym is DEEP. So I'm botching it. But I know that that's the acronym. But it's crazy. That's what I'm saying. I think it is environmental and emergency because I think that they're a merged agency. So maybe I was right. Is it talking about emergencies too? They'd merged it. Okay, so then I was right, but I knew it was DEEP. Okay. Okay, so the FOIA request, so that's a great question. No, it's something with emergencies. That doesn't matter. But if you get that request, Enza, I'll look up the statute and get you the right acronym. So Selena had a question. So if I get a request for any and all correspondences between all Board of Education members on December 11th, right? That's going to be really difficult to get right away. That's going to take some time and some due diligence to do, right? Because I'm first going to have to notify all of you that there's been a request. I'm going to have to, in essence, put a litigation hold in place to say, look for all of this, give this to me, don't destroy any of it, which is why I would always recommend that you only use your Board of Ed email. Because of these requests, it would be very difficult to try to get everything off of your own personal account. And so this is one of the reasons why we would recommend that you use your board account so that all board business IT can capture it if we have to respond to these requests. You have 4 business days to respond. That doesn't mean we have 4 business days because we're all so busy to get 200 correspondences that may have transpired in that day because maybe you were changing your mascot, right? So you might have had a lot of correspondences that day. It does mean that Dr. Macri, within 4 business days, has to say, I'm formally acknowledging receipt of your request. I will respond promptly. If we have a request that dates back several years and might take us a long time to do, we do have an obligation to let the requester know that it's going to take some time and we're going to do what we can. To Matt's point, there are a lot of really small school districts who get a lot of these requests. They don't have central office. The superintendent is the central office. And so in some cases, it might take them 6 months to get you that information because some of the searches that are generated could be 30,000 documents that somehow that superintendent has to find time to look through, or they have to pay a law firm a lot of money to look through, which is not the way you want to spend your scarce resources. Okay, so that was the executive session. So I want to be sensitive on time. I can just briefly go through electronic communications. There is a lot more, but we can always, I just want to be respectful about your time because you said 1 hour. So I can end on this, and then if there's questions, we can certainly talk about questions, whatever you want us to do. Oh, yeah, I can email them to you, too. So the other thing that that's later on in the presentation is really more about Robert's rules, which you probably have a sense of. And so you can certainly, so let me go through this one because I think this is a really important one. And then I'm happy to answer any questions. And then I will email you and Dr. Macri the slides. You can forward it on to everyone. And so that's timely because when Selena forwards that on to you, one-on-one communications like that is perfectly appropriate under FOIA. But what I wouldn't want is then for all of you to respond to her communication that has my PowerPoint, even though it may not be that you're discussing a board business, it could be construed as somehow there's a quorum of you talking about something through email when we know we have to do that at a publicly posted meeting. All right, so here's the scenario. So it's time for the Nutmeg Board to elect officers. In the week leading up to the annual meeting, the internet is full of emails among board members soliciting support from other members. In addition, board members had caucused with their respective party chairs to decide on who would be the next chair. At the meeting, Malcontent nominates Penny Pitcher as the next chair. Infuriated, Bob Bombast sends an angry text message to Mal saying, "What gives? I thought we had a deal." Mal responds, "Sorry, Penny's supporting me for vice chair. You snooze, you lose." So here's the question. And this is, which statement is correct? So we only have one about the incorrect. So 1, is it illegal, or it is illegal for board members to commit support on an issue before the actual meeting? 2, a majority of board members cannot discuss board business via email. 3, electronic communication between board members is okay as long as it's one-on-one. And board members cannot caucus to discuss board issues. So which statement is correct? Okay. Anyone want to share? All right. So, yeah, Dr. Macri, do you raise your? Oh. I know the answer, but I'm not. Okay. Sure. I want everyone to learn from you. You're the professional. Anyone else? Well, not see my ring. Okay. Number 2 is right. What'd you say, Alan? Number 2 is right. Okay, so number 1. But here's the trick to this one. And actually, I went to the commission on this very issue in number 1 last year. So it is not problematic. So let's say Selena's running for chair. It is not a problem if Selena calls Matt and says, "Matt, will you support me for chair?" Perfectly appropriate. Politicians do that all the time. It's okay for Selena to call Jen, say, "Jen, will you support me as chair?" Perfectly fine, perfectly appropriate. You can call Alan, you can call Kelly, you can go down the list. Where it's going to be a problem, though, Selena, is if you call Matt and say, "Matt, are you going to support me for chair? Because Alan told me he's supporting me." Then you call Alan and say, "Alan, Matt told me he's going to support me. Jen also confirmed she's going to support me." Then you call Kelly and say, "Kelly, Matt, Dipti, Jen, Alan, they all told me that they're going to support me." Because now what you've done is a game of telephone. You now, even though these parties may not have communicated, you're the link that has shared with a quorum of the board what the other person is going to do. This is a very nuanced issue, but it is an issue I went to the commission on last year. That is going to be viewed as potentially an illegal meeting because you have essentially had a meeting of the minds on a quorum of the board. That is distinguishable from you calling each and every single board member saying, "Will you support me?" I just would highly recommend that you don't share what everyone else told you. Now, what I went to was not about the chairmanship. What I went to was a very much more complicated, much more significant issue. Not that that isn't a significant issue, but this was something related to a spending of a significant amount of money. And so there were people in the community who were very hot to trot on it, which is why that went to hearing. But they draw a very nuanced distinction between that game of telephone versus unilateral conversations. So we just need to be cognizant of that. You cannot discuss board business via email. We know that. I'd be careful on subcommittees to do that too. One-on-one is okay, perfectly fine, but remember, it'll be subject to disclosure, so the newspaper can get it, parents can get it. I would say that it's okay for Selena to send, one time where it's okay for you to send is, "Hey, can the 9 of you be available on December 14th at 7 for a presentation with our legal counsel?" And everyone responds to that. That's not a problem because that's not about a board business to be transacted. So things like scheduling, if you all respond, that's fine because how else are you going to schedule these meetings? So I want to draw that distinction too. And obviously we know you can caucus. So I know we also spent a lot of time kind of in the beginning too about emails. And again, if there's one takeaway, I would just say pick up the phone without sharing the thoughts of every other board member to that board member if you can, and not create the record if possible. It also save you a lot of money if they do a search and it generates no hits, right? But happy to answer any questions. You know, obviously you have such broad inherent statutory powers. It's a pretty incredible responsibility. And I know for some of you who may be new to the board, some of this is pretty jarring at first. But as your veteran board members will tell you, I'm sure it's all worth it. So, yeah, Matt.
So common practice where I work is to maybe send an email, hey, you ever been to touch base about an issue?
Yeah.
That's safer because you're doing it in person, there's no written record, or even by phone, there's still no written record. There may be a phone record that you spoke by phone, you can certainly ask what was the discussion about, but it's safer than putting things in email in general because if an FOI happens, they can request what was the conversation about. But you and I never remember what the conversation was about, or you may not have cleared it.
Yep.
As opposed to right. Is that generally a safe?
It is. The only thing I would say is, so let's say like in my issue from last year, if you send a text message like that to every single person on the board on that same night, then it creates that nuance issue I was talking about. But yeah, I mean, look, you guys have the right to talk to each other. You just have to be mindful that there are limitations on how you're able to communicate with one another.
I have an idea for something I wanted to bring to the board to have a discussion at a future meeting. I can email her and say, hey, we need to touch base about something. I have a couple of ideas I want to toss around. That's just kind of a safe thing.
Absolutely. And really the chair should be, the flow of communication should go through the chair. That's perfectly appropriate. And in fact, you know, I'm sure, Selena, will you, in terms of setting the agenda, how have you been doing that? Is it with you and Dr. Macri? Is it you and I think Catherine, are you the vice chair? Is it with you and Catherine setting the agenda? Yeah, so that's great. That's great. But also if Matt wanted to call you and say, hey, Selena, I'd like to see this on the agenda, he certainly can do that. Now, you set the agenda, so you legally would have the right to say, I'm not putting that on the agenda, but there is a statutory provision that would say if 3 board members wanted it to be on the agenda, you'd have to address that. So you couldn't just unilaterally always say to the minority party, I'm never putting your items on the agenda. It's fine, but what I would say is, here's the update. Now, remember, what's the update about? I don't want it to be anything confidential, personnel related, student related. So one, if the update is sensitive information, I wouldn't put in an email because it's still going to be subject to disclosure. So forget the meeting part, but I can still request the document and take possession of it. So be mindful about that. So if it's just an update on very generic issues, it's fine, but you say, do not reply all. So you are literally just giving them information that they are to absorb, but they should not be responding to you about what you've provided, unless it's something as as innocuous as scheduling. Or, great job, Selena, I appreciate this. I prefer they don't even do that, and you should say, please don't reply all. They could reply to you individually and say, great job, thank you. But I wouldn't want your communication that is to the full board then to solicit feedback individually from other board members, because that could potentially be problematic too. But you can pick up the phone and call her. Yeah. Any other questions? And, certainly I will share the presentation with you, and then if that triggers any other questions. And then if I'm on an email, there's also privilege associated with that. So sometimes it's helpful in what you're saying. If we found ourselves really needing to convey information sometimes, better that it comes from me if it is sensitive, because then we can preserve it as privilege if it's requested. Yeah, so your bylaws may or may not speak to this, but most bylaws say that the only people who are legally authorized to incur legal expense are the superintendent of schools and the board chair, unless they specifically authorize you. So if you ever call me and you're not Selena or Dr. Macri, don't be insulted. I've had to say this plenty of times. I would just say, hey, Matt, I'd love to talk to you. I just ethically, I've got to get the okay from Selena. And then Selena might just text me and be like, oh, yeah, of course, Matt can talk to you. And that's perfectly appropriate. Selena can authorize that. Just like Dr. Macri can authorize Michelle Demaro to call me, right? Because Dr. Macri can't be involved in every little personnel issue. That's perfectly fine, but it has to come from one of you to authorize that. No, you don't. And you, of course, it's a scarce resource. And also, we ethically, I don't, even if your bylaws didn't say that, I don't want to incur a cost that hasn't been authorized by your elected chair. I don't want to charge you or bill you for that. And then sometimes I've gotten calls from other board members who did not have the authority to call me and want to undo something, and it can be compromising too to get those calls. And then the other thing too is, you have a privilege as an entity. You don't have a privilege with me as an individual. So Dipti can't call me and say, hey, Jess, I'm going to talk to you about this, but you're not allowed to tell Selena, because the privilege belongs with the entity. So even Selena and I are correspondences. That is not a privilege to Selena. That's a privilege to the full board, and you would have the right to see those correspondences. So I want to be clear on that. I'm not a personal attorney for any individual here. I'm the attorney for the entity. And in the rare circumstance, and Dr. Macri is an extension of that, in the rare circumstance where you may have a differing stance on something, so Dr. Macri's employment contract, I'm your lawyer. I'm not Dr. Macri's lawyer. In situations like a student issue, a personnel issue, Dr. Macri is an extension of you. So then again, I'm the lawyer to the entity. She's essentially an ex officio, right? An extension of it. But if we're talking about her employment specifically, she would need her own lawyer, and I am your lawyer. So that's a good question, Catherine. So in that situation, that's a due process issue for the student. So in that situation, if you are separate entities there, but you're not necessarily adverse to Dr. Macri, you're just separate entities, meaning Dr. Macri can't give you information ahead of time in a student discipline proceeding. So if you both wanted lawyers for a very complicated hearing, let's say, you would both want lawyers, but they cannot both be from Shipman, because that would be a due process issue for the student, which is why Shipman would either sit with the board or sit with the administration, but not both. Conversely, if it's a personnel issue, not a teacher termination, but through the contract process, I can literally represent the administration and the board at the same time, because that's not the same due process issue as a full-blown teacher termination hearing is, or a student expulsion issue. I know it's a little complicated, but it does make sense when you get through it. Yeah. But for the most part, you are a collective entity with Dr. Macri as an extension.
Well, in the reality, we can, if 6 months from now, I don't remember something that we covered tonight, it's as easy as asking the question.
Of course. And you can ask Selena, hey, can I... Well,
And
I
it's
will
all on
email,
YouTube. It's all captured on YouTube, so.
I'll email this to you and to Dr. Macri, so you can forward it. And then, certainly if there are follow-up questions, you could email Selena, and Selena can reach out to me.
Okay, perfect.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much. I know how late it is, so I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Yeah. All right, so is there a motion to adjourn? Kelly, second. Dipti, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions?